Superhero video games have known to not turn out very well. Batman, for example, has no shortage of video game adaptations, but only a handful or two of them are worthy of being a part of the Dark Knight's legacy. One of them is Batman Arkham Asylum. Batman Arkham Asylum was developed by Rocksteady Studios and released in 2009. Rocksteady only had made one game previously, being Urban Chaos Riot Response, which was a pretty solid FPS game, but nothing to write home about. But the studio was then given the opportunity to work on a Batman game, which was a risk for the company, as if they screwed it up, then their reputation would join the ranks of the other developers who failed to do Batman justice. And those companies didn't live for very long after doing so. However, this risk also came with the reward of being one of the only developers to make a Batman game and do a damn fine job doing so. And it paid off. Batman Arkham Asylum was not only a commercial success, selling over 4 million copies, but it also received very positive praise from fans and critics. The game even brought on people who had been working with DC material for a while. An example being Paul Dini, who was one of the biggest Batman story writers ever, was brought on to write the story for the game. Voice work from the animated series also came on board, such as Kevin Conroy as Batman, Mark Hamill as the Joker. Yeah, it honestly still blows my mind that fucking Luke Skywalker is the Joker, and Arlene Sorkin to voice Harley Quinn. And I think this is one of the reasons why the game became a success, because a lot of people working on the game had a huge amount of experience with the material. Anyway, it's now been over 10 years since Arkham Asylum released, and I thought I'd take a look back on the game since I am a huge Batman fan. I grew up reading a lot of the comics, I still remember watching The Dark Knight in the theatre, the animated series is my favourite cartoon of all time, so yeah, Batman is an important character to me, and I want to analyse the game to see if they managed to do him justice. The game opens the way your standard Batman story ends, with Batman apprehending the Joker and taking him to Arkham Asylum.
Stand back, fool, I've got a bomb! Huh? All right.
However, Batman senses that something isn't right, which then leads to this 7-minute long walk-in segment where Batman follows the security guards taking Joker. I think this works well as an opening sequence because the game introduces the basic movement controls while also introducing many characters that will play a role later on in the story. The back and forth between the Joker and Batman is what makes this opening sequence entertaining.
Ooh, would you sneak in with your bats? Come on, tell me. Batarangs, bat claws, ooh, bat snacks.
Besides, I don't think it would work if it was a cutscene. Yeah, you're not really doing much in this segment, but since you are in control of Batman, it does help you build a connection with the surrounding environment, which a cutscene couldn't really do. I do think this section goes on for a bit too long, and could have been trimmed a bit, but I think it overall works as a way to get the player introduced to the area they will be playing in for the entire game. Although it is strange how Batman doesn't catch on to what Joker is planning even when he literally spells it out to him.
Sweet! Great night for a party!
Not where you're going.
The night is young, Bats. I still have a trick or two up my sleeve. I mean, don't you think it's a little bit funny how a fire at Blackgate caused hundreds of my crew to be moved here?
I thought Batman was the world's greatest detective. Anyway, surprise, it was all a trap and Joker breaks free. Anyway, this is where the gameplay starts, so I should probably get into that before talking about the rest of the story. Arkham Asylum is a beat-em-up game with stealth elements, which isn't surprising considering most Batman games have been like that. However, Arkham Asylum has the most refined gameplay out of the bunch. The game has two styles of combat, being brawler combat and predator combat. The brawler combat is pretty simplistic, and I think it is a bit too simplistic. You have one button to punch and one button to counter attacks. That's the basic gist of it. There are new combat moves you can obtain, such as a throw attack or a special takedown, which require a certain number of combo points to pull off. You can also use batarangs and batclaws in the combat to knock enemies down or bring them towards you, and it not only gives you more points for using a variety of moves, but it also looks cool while you do it. There is also a ground takedown which takes the enemy out for good, but requires a good amount of time to pull it off. The game's combat works fine mechanically, but I think it's a bit too simplistic. First of all, there isn't much variety with the gadgets. Most of the gadgets are variations of the batarang, and there isn't really many opportunities to use them in combat. The game is way too easy because all the countable attacks are way too telegraphed. You pretty much only have to press 2 buttons throughout the entire game. There is this one knife enemy which requires you to stun him first, and his attacks can't be countered, and there is this stun baton guy which can stop you from just pressing the same 2 buttons, but these guys only appear a few times in the game, so they don't bring much variety to the combat. The game doesn't really encourage you to get better with its combat, and the combat itself doesn't really get any deeper as you progress. The combat you start off with is basically the same you end with. By the end of the game, you have a few more tools in your belt, but it's still the same belt at the end of the day. Not to mention that, as I said, the game is just far too easy. Hard mode is only somewhat challenging because you actually have to use your eyes and watch for the enemy's attacks, and not just have the blue header tell you when to counter. I guess this is more of a subjective thing, but I prefer combat systems that push me to perfect my playstyle, rather than a game that is basically just a quick time event. I only died once in a brawler section because of how overly basic the combat is. To be clear, there is nothing wrong with having simplistic combat, but the issue is that the combat in this game doesn't encourage skill or perfection with its mechanics. As said, you can literally just keep pressing the same 2 buttons to win most encounters, and the game totally encourages that. There are these Titan-enhanced mini-bosses later on in the game, but in terms of enemy variety, there just isn't much. I think the game needed more enemies to encourage the player to use different gadgets and tactics to take them down, and also give more gadgets to use in combat. There are combat challenge maps which encourage you to get as high score as possible, so I guess these challenge maps encourage you to get skilled with the combat, but for the actual story campaign, you don't really have to use any strategy or skill to beat the game. The game doesn't have enough depth to encourage one to get better at the combat and learn more about the mechanics. Like I said, not every game needs a super complex amount of depth to it. If a game wants to be simple, that's fine, but when the combat never has any meaningful evolution throughout the course of the game, and the game has as much depth as a sheet of paper, that's an issue. Basically, the brawler combat is mechanically fine, but is very repetitive and requires almost no skill to play it. The stealth combat, however, is a big improvement, as you have multiple ways to approach the situation and multiple ways to take enemies out. You can get creative with how you use your gadgets, and the game never tells you all the options for taking enemies out. You're left to your own imagination on how you want to approach these situations. Plus, the enemies are a genuine challenge, since their gunfire can take you out in a couple of shots. What's also cool is that the enemies have different modes in which they attack you, and as you start picking off enemies one by one, they become more afraid and less trustworthy of one another, leading to more unique challenges as you progress through the room. So yeah, the stealth combat in the game is actually really good. I find the contrast really funny here. The brawler combat is really basic and easy, whereas stealth has some cool depth and is pretty challenging. So basically, half the game is awesome, half the game is mediocre. In terms of other gameplay aspects, the exploration of the asylum is handled really well. There are a lot of Riddler collectibles and riddles to solve, and they encourage you to explore the environment. And finding these collectibles gives you more XP, unless you can level up more, so there is somewhat incentive to do it. The detective gameplay may as well not even be in the game. All you do is look at an object and hold a button. Since Batman is the world's greatest detective, it would have made more sense to flesh out the detective aspect of the gameplay. Maybe make it so where the player has to try and piece parts of a scene together. I don't know, I just don't find holding one button very engaging gameplay. My issue with Arkham Asylum is that most of the game is just overly simplistic, and thus it never gets interesting apart from the stealth sections. The boss fights are kind of bad, to be honest. The only decent one is Poison Ivy, but even then she's really easy to beat. Bane just has you fight some random henchman and then throw a batarang at him once in a while. Killer Croc has a cool atmosphere, but all you do is just walk around and throw a batarang at him when he pops out. Titan Joker just has you fight some henchmen before then jumping down every once in a while. Scarecrow once again has a cool atmosphere, but you just walk from one location to another, avoiding his light. Since you follow a linear path, it's kind of boring. Overall, the boss fights are just kind of meh. And to be honest, that kind of goes for most of the game. I wouldn't say any aspects of Arkham Asylum are bad. At worst, the game is tolerable, and the stealth sections are the peak, being awesome, but most of the game lies somewhere in between, where it's just okay. It's a shame because I did spend so many hours playing this game back in the day, but looking back, the gameplay just hasn't aged very well. The brawler combat is overly simplistic, there isn't much gadget or enemy variety. The only time the game does encourage you to get better and skilled with the combat is in the challenge maps, and really the only fully fleshed out part of the gameplay is the stealth. I will say that the brawler combat was heavily improved in the later games, but in this game it just isn't really all that great. Also, the game doesn't really have much replay value apart from collecting all the Riddler trophies. The challenge maps are cool, but they only add on a couple hours of content, so unless you are a big fan of the gameplay in this game, then you probably won't be playing the game all that much. Overall, Arkham Asylum's gameplay is at best really fun and just okay at its worst. The game never gets below average, but most of it isn't anything spectacular. I would say the gameplay has more positives than negatives, but the negatives are still pretty big ones in my eyes. However, Batman is a character known for having awesome stories with cool characters, so let's see if the game lives up to that. In terms of story, the game is a loose adaptation of Arkham Asylum: A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison. I say loose because while both share similarities of the story taking place almost entirely in the asylum, and focusing on Batman's villains, where they differ is the actual story. Serious House on Serious Earth was about the Joker trying to prove that Batman is just as crazy as the criminals he brings in, whereas the game is about Joker taking over the asylum so that he can use the Titan formula from Bane to create Titan-enhanced thugs to take over Gotham. It's a pretty simple story and works fine because of the characters. The reason why Batman is regarded to have the best rogues gallery in comics is because of the variety of them all. Each of Batman's villains attack Batman on a different level. Bane uses his physicality to fight Batman, Scarecrow forces Batman to face his deepest, darkest fears, the Riddler forces Batman to use his intellect to overcome riddles, Joker makes Batman become just as crazy to defeat him, yada yada. This makes for a seemingly infinite number of story possibilities for the Caped Crusader. Which is funny because Batman writers never want to do anything unique with the character and just want to tell the same stories over and over and over and over and over again. Kind of ironic. In that sense, Arkham Asylum doesn't break any new ground with the character. Not that it was really trying to. The team at Rocksteady were clearly more focused on making the game good before making it unique, which is a fair choice. And for long-time Batman fans, this game is a huge treat, since you have one of the major writers for the animated series and comics writing the characters, and you have the most established voices of those characters doing the voiceover. It helps legitimize the game as part of the Batman mythos. I will never get sick of the interactions between Conroy and Hamill.
I can take it. I can take anything you throw at me, Bats. You can't beat me. I'm actually going to win. Ready for the next round?
Always.
What?
I'll never let you win. Never.
Crazy?
Pretty much all the interactions with the villains are awesome because, as I said, they're all very unique and challenge Batman in different ways. My favourite being the Scarecrow interactions, in particular the third Scarecrow interaction, where there is this fake game crash and now you're playing as the Joker.
If you have any questions, please visit us at www.ithinkimgoing.
Please, just let us go. We won't try to escape.
I'm not crazy! I shouldn't be here! Keep those mouths shut!
Batman! Batman, can you hear me? They're taking us outside. They're gonna kill us
Hey,
all.
sweetums, you're gonna miss the party!
One detail I do like is that instead of pressing B to skip the cutscene, the game tells you to press J, and when Joker kills you, it tells you to use the middle stick as if it's a Nintendo 64 game. I love cool details like that. I also think the game is paced very well. It always feels like every section has progressed the story in a big way, and it never feels as if you're just doing busy work. There are some sections where villains are just there to slow Batman down, but as I said, they add to his character and his endless struggle to fight the evil of Gotham. Arkham Asylum is a very short game. I mean, on my normal playthrough it took me 6 hours, and on my hard playthrough it took me just under 3. But I was never bored the entire time, and there were never any moments where the game, or the narrative in particular, got slow or uninteresting. Not to mention that despite some of the gameplay elements of the game being lacking in some areas, the gameplay and the story both work in unity, and it never feels as if both elements are fighting for dominance. The story creates the gameplay scenarios, and the gameplay scenarios drive the story. The game almost always leaves all the cool action pieces to the gameplay, and the cutscenes are only used to develop the story, or start and end boss fights. Although, speaking of the cutscenes, one flaw with the game nowadays is that the cutscenes were rendered in 720p, which was fine when the game released in 2009, but over 10 years later, it just makes the cutscenes look pixely and blurry. I don't know how well it will come across with YouTube's compression, but all the gameplay sections look much sharper than the pre-rendered cutscenes. It's not a huge deal since all the pre-rendered cutscenes still look great and are all well animated, but it is distracting. However, it's not really Rocksteady's fault. I do also like how the game does have a satisfying conclusion while leaving room for a sequel. In fact, I love that the story has an already established Batman who is familiar with all these villains. It feels as if this Batman has already been through all the cool stories you read in the comics, and this just happens to be the one the developers wanted to tell. I think the simplicity of the story also helped, as it allowed the game to establish the characters enough that you would want to see more of them. Overall, Arkham Asylum's story is pretty simple, but that helps the relationship between Batman and his villains be explored in cool ways throughout the game, and the game gives you enough to keep you satisfied but leaves you wanting more. The writing from Paul Dini is top-notch, and the performances by all the cast, not just Kevin and Mark, helps bring these characters to life in a way that no other Batman game has done before. So yeah, Asylum's story is pretty solid. In conclusion, I would say that Batman Arkham Asylum is one of those good, but not as good as you remember games. The gameplay is overall pretty solid, but lacks depth and variety, and thus does wear thin over the course of the game. The story is very simplistic and doesn't really do anything new or interesting with the character, but it is still a solid and enjoyable one nonetheless. Arkham Asylum would then get a sequel 2 years later with Arkham City, which was even more successful than the first game, a prequel in 2013 which was mixed, and then Arkham Knight in 2015 which had a lukewarm response, but overall sold pretty well. There was also some comics released, a VR game, and an animated film and so forth. But the Arkham franchise all started with this game, and over 10 years later, despite all the flaws I have expressed with Arkham Asylum, I still think it is a worthwhile experience, especially for Batman fans.